Hello, I'm Milan Sharavinsky and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. A crucial moment is just around the corner. The elections in the United States, which may define not just the future of the country itself, but also of much of the Western world and beyond. Donald Trump facing off against Kamala Harris. With the campaign reaching its conclusion, we're going to talk about what do these elections mean for the US, for basically people in the Central and Eastern European region and for the Euro-Atlantic cooperation in general. Joining us now is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me here.
So let me begin by a quote from Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk. I am quoting from memory, but the general contents of his tweet were such that regardless of who wins these elections, Europe actually needs to step up its efforts. The era of geopolitical outsourcing has ended. Would you agree with that statement to some extent?
Just speaking personally, I had said a generation ago, before the events like 9/11, before the events like Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that Europe needed to not just follow the United States, it needed to be able to stand up and represent its position in partnership with the US. In part, that was because the United States at that time was getting involved in some very ill-advised foreign interventions. Think about Iraq 2003, think about the quagmire in Afghanistan. But it was also the fact that the world was changing. You in Poland know that the world was changing with the expansion of the European Union, with the developments in the countries that had been in the Soviet sphere of influence. And so, yes, I think that what Vladimir Putin did in 2022 was give a wake-up call with that invasion of Ukraine to European countries about something they should have done much earlier. The hope here is in 2024, again, whatever happens in the United States, but especially if Donald Trump gets back into the White House, that Europe can establish its own foreign and defense policy and not simply have to be dependent on what might happen in Washington.
So Trump supporters may actually feel vindicated because they are immediately going to say, look, this is what Trump has been saying all along. Nobody rides for free. The problem is Trump also said a few other things. How would you say this may actually influence the result of the vote, given that Trump recently said some of our allies are exploiting us, meaning the United States, and they are, and once again I quote, worse than our so-called enemies?
Trump never made his call for members to increase their contribution in defense spending to NATO because Donald Trump was concerned about the future of NATO. Let's remember two things. First of all, that commitment to increase GDP to 2% was made by NATO members in 2014 at the summit in Wales. Now, some members were lagging behind, but there was, a signal from NATO, look, we need to do this for ourselves, not because Donald Trump tells us to do that. Secondly, Donald Trump is always interested in what's good for Donald Trump. His simple view of NATO is that NATO takes money from the United States, that it rips off the United States. And therefore, he was going to bash NATO for doing this and individual members, whether it be Germany, whether it be Poland, whether it be someone else. And that's his attitude towards allies. He doesn't see any benefit from cooperation. He simply sees a transactional relationship where if the U.S. makes a contribution to an alliance, it's losing. That's why he's threatened to pull out of NATO. We need to be clear about that. That's why he's tried to break up the European Union. We need to be clear about that. And the only time when he will support a country with its defense policy is when they play to his ego, such as when Poland said, well, we might have an American base here and we'll call it Fort Trump. And then he said, oh, Poland's very good because they've made me look good.
So what would you say is going to be the message relayed to voters, American voters of Central European descent? Because this indeed has actually, turned into something of a major issue there, because there is, for example, a large Polish minority in certain, in a number of battleground states. So how will Kamala Harris intend to address these voters? How will Trump be trying to, to woo them to his cause? What do you think is going to happen here?
Well, let's remember that Polish American voters or Ukrainian American voters don't vote just because of a single issue. So there will be domestic issues that concern them, whether it be the economy, whether it be the question of asylum seekers and migrants, whether it will be health care, whether it will be Trump's threat to democracy. But that being said, the Harris campaign has clearly set out to Polish American voters, look, we care about Ukraine. We care about the defense of Ukraine. We care about the defense of Central and Eastern Europe. We care about that at a point when Vladimir Putin is a threat to all of us. In contrast, Donald Trump's message to Polish Americans, if not explicitly, implicitly, is I don't care what happens to Ukraine. I think Vladimir Zelensky rips us off. I don't care if Russia succeeds in conquering part of Ukraine. I think Vladimir Putin is a great guy. And I think that's a very important contrasting message when, as you mentioned quite well, there are almost 800,000 Poles who live in Pennsylvania. There are almost 800,000 who live in Michigan, almost 500,000 in Wisconsin. Now, not all of those Poles can vote. Some of them are a bit too young. But still, in a campaign where tens of thousands of votes could be the difference in who gets elected, yes, Polish Americans taking account of those key messages, especially the threat to Central Europe, may be decisive in deciding whether it's Harris who defends Europe and gets back into the White House, or whether Trump gets back into the White House and threatens to abandon Central Europe.
So what about the point of view that I've seen, for example, in right-wing media in Poland, which have been very supportive of Trump recently, and they keep saying, look, Trump was the tough guy, he knew how to deal with dictators around the world, they respected him, no wars have actually started, and we as Poland are paying the 4% threshold to NATO, which is above the requirement, so we're pretty safe. Do you think that this sort of stance actually misses certain points that could be crucial into basically distinguishing, the way that Trump was approaching his first term and what he could do in the second term? Do you think that simply saying the first term was not so bad, so let's have another one, does it work in the current geopolitical climate?
Well, with respect, there are politicians who take this tough guy pose alongside Trump. And I think you've seen it in your country. We've seen it with Hungary's Viktor Orban, who came out just 24 hours ago and gave firm support to Trump and effectively Vladimir Putin. But let's compare that tough guy pose with what happened in reality during a Trump administration. We now know from revelations that came out earlier this month that in 2017, Vladimir Putin pulled Donald Trump aside at the G20 summit in Germany, and he lectured Trump for a half hour about how bad Ukraine was, how bad the Ukrainian government was. And in effect, he got Trump to support Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine that was already taking place. In 2019, this tough guy Trump, well, he was tough with Ukraine by blackmailing it, by threatening to cut off and indeed cutting off military aid because they wouldn't dish disinformation on Joe Biden. But he wasn't a tough guy with Vladimir Putin. Indeed, when Vladimir Putin criticized U.S. intelligence agencies and the U.S. government, Donald Trump supported Putin. So no, let's be very clear here. This is not a question of being a tough guy. This is a question of who Donald Trump supports and who he doesn't support in foreign policy. Now, he might support members of the former government of Poland. That might be domestic politics playing out in terms of what they're saying now. But let us be clear. He also supports Kim in North Korea. He supports Xi in China. And he supports Vladimir Putin in Russia because he admires them. And we just have to be clear about that. We shouldn't be led by our own domestic politics to avoid that fundamental.
Professor Scott Lucas was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thanks to you and your viewers.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us for more latest news and updates.